Going to be catching up with the TWU. There are some concerns with a new draft piece of legislation. It's only a draft, but if it goes through, the TWU is anxious about how this is going to affect drivers, that they will in fact be the ones at the bottom of the food chain of the impacts on this. Michael Kane is from the TWU. Michael, good to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much.
Oh, good morning, Anne.
Now, this piece of legislation, it came after the National Transport Commission has recommended a draft legislation. What's the recommendation?
Well, the recommendation is that you take trucks off the road if they've been detected above 115 kilometres an hour, and the NTC is saying that should be taken as evidence that companies have tampered with speed limiters, and and any measure that's put in place that has the potential to make the roads safer is something that we should all consider very carefully. The question here, though, is really, what are the pressures that are on those transport companies to put them in a position that they are breaching the law in that way in the first place? And our concern is that, of course, if a truck is speeding dangerously and a transport operator has put that truck in that position, then we need to get that truck off the road. That's one part of it. But the most important part is how are we going to deal with the pressures that have led the transport operator to believe it can act in that way in the first place. And that's what this type of law doesn't do, even though it purports to do it. And there's a real concern that this type of law just deals with the symptom and not the underlying causes. So
where are your concerns then with the causes?
Well, this is an industry that's under incredible pressure. Over 3 decades of evidence now, including a seminal report that's been read in countries all over the world by governments from the NTC in 2008, where the NTC itself concluded that if you deal only with the symptoms in this industry, on-road symptoms such as speeding, breach of driving hours, use of artificial stimulants to stay awake, then you won't get to the root causes, those root causes being the pressures on the companies that are forcing them into the position that they are having to force their drivers to take these risks. And those pressures come from the very top of the transport supply chains, from those who are asking for the freight to be moved, like very major international manufacturers and the major retailers. They're literally squeezing those transport operators so hard that to maintain their contracts, to keep the wheels turning around and to keep their businesses afloat, they're having to take shortcuts. And until we deal with those pressures, then on-road behaviour such as that targeted by this draft NTC law is going to continue to happen, and people will continue to lose their lives on our roads.
So what would you like to see happen before any amendment to the legislation?
Well, an important piece of legislation arose from the 2008 National Transport Commission report that I've spoken about. That report gathered together 2 decades of evidence that said you needed to deal with those underlying causes. And arising from that was put in place a piece of legislation called the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal. And that tribunal had started to make orders to deal with those underlying causes. It had the power to deal with those underlying causes, and it was dealing with them. Unfortunately, that tribunal has now fallen victim to some election cycle politics, and it's been abolished. But the capacity of that tribunal was really important, and I think people now, since the abolition, are just starting to realise that you don't realise what you've got until it's gone. A tribunal that could ensure that those at the very top of the supply chain, like the major retailers, were paying enough to transport operators so that they could have sustainable businesses, so that they didn't have to put their drivers under pressure. And this is life and death stuff here. 2,548 Australians have lost their lives over the last decade in trucking accidents, and that's a national catastrophe and a national emergency. And we really need to be thinking about what can we put in place to get to those underlying pressures, as opposed to band-aid measures that are really not going to modify behaviour in our industry.
Now, we'll take a tangent while you're mentioning there on the RSRT before we continue talking about this draft for legislation. we know at the moment, Michael, that, well, who knows? It's a bit of a coin toss at the moment what we're going to see as far as who forms government in this country. We know that the government of the day abolished it. We had many, many discussions on this program about the ins and outs of that discussion. Now we also had the ALP, not so much during the election campaign, but prior to the official campaign, saying that if they won government, they would reinstate the RSRT. So are you waiting with bated breath at the moment to see which way this is going to go?
As I mentioned, Anne, it was really regrettable that that tribunal fell victim to election cycle politics. The tribunal had put in place an order, a first order, which did four really important things. Having the work performed safely before the driver got behind the wheel. I know that sounds logical, but that wasn't done through safe driving plans. There were drug and alcohol policies. There was that client accountability that I've just spoken about. And importantly for owner drivers in the industry, those that own their own vehicle, they're small businesses, there were maximum payment terms of 30 days so that they couldn't be used as finance for those in the supply chain above them, and they had to be paid in a timely fashion. Now, talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's now gone because this tribunal's been abolished. We will be working hard with our members and transport workers across the country, no matter who is in government, to make the point that you don't change behaviour in this industry unless you get to those with the economic power and ensure that they are paying their fair share. And regardless of what that looks like, we want to work with industry and government to ensure that it's that type of underlying pressure that's dealt with in the system, because it's only then that we're going to get real change.
So what would the RSRT do if it was reinstated? What would it do that's not already covered by the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator?
Well, the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator has an important place. Its job really has been to harmonise a plethora of discrete state laws across the country, and that's a really important function. But those state laws really deal with post-breach issues. That is, after someone's dead or after someone's caught speeding, what is the penalty that can be put in place, in the hope that putting a penalty in place will deter behaviour and modify behaviour. But we know from many years of evidence, both in this industry and in the criminal law sector, that the deterrence effect is highly dubious. You don't change behaviour unless you get to the underlying causes, and the NHVR can't deal with those economic causes. The tribunal could, and if there, we will be saying that there needs to be some system in place, regardless of what it looks like, that has the capacity to deal with those economic pressures. The NHVR can't do that. The tribunal could, and we need a system in the future that can.
Do you think that the crossbenchers, because at the moment we really don't know the makeup of the Senate, it's a bit of a mess, we're not quite sure how that's going to happen and won't know for some time. We're getting a better shape for the House of Reps with some new players in the crossbench there. Are you confident that they would be able to back the ALP if it came to power on reinstating the RSRT?
One thing I'm really confident of, because of the representations that have been made by transport workers and bereaved families over the years, is that when those families and workers sit down with parliamentarians and take them through the story of the pressures in this industry that have led to loved ones being lost or have led to them losing their business or becoming bankrupt, each parliamentarian absolutely fully understands that. And when parliamentarians accept that if you just focus on on-road behaviour as a kind of band-aid solution, that's a failed strategy, then they are all ears about what is the next step. That's why the tribunal was put into law in the first place. The tribunal was put in place under a minority Labor government, which required crossbenchers in the lower house and crossbenchers in the upper house. And those parliamentarians listened to those stories from bereaved families and transport workers and came to their own conclusions. And we're confident that when they hear those stories again, they'll understand that we need something in place that deals with those causes so we can keep Australians safer on the roads.
Now, returning to this piece of draft legislation from the National Transport Commission, seeing heavy vehicles caught driving 15 kilometres or more above the speed limit, Is it something, Michael, that, look, if you're breaking the law by that much, you've fiddled with your speed limiter, you're speeding in a dangerous way. This is not 1 or 2 clicks over. This is 15 kilometres or more an hour over the speed limit. Isn't this just a case of, look, cop it on the chin? If you're breaking the law that much by either fiddling with your speed limiter or getting your foot down, if you break the law, you break the law. Just sit up and cop it on the chin.
There's no doubt about that. Enforcement on our roads is a critical component. We do not want trucks on our roads and truck operators that are in a situation where they are putting drivers in danger and the road-using community in danger. The question here, though, Anne, is cop it on the chin, yes, get those trucks off the road. Perhaps that's a good idea if they're driving in that excessive way, and drivers are being forced to drive in that excessive way by speed limiter tampering, and get the truck off the road is certainly something that's worth considering. But the next step to say that is somehow going to stop other operators or even that operator from engaging in the same behaviour just is not borne out by the evidence. And what you'll find, as we've found in the past, is that if there's a 15-kilometre arbitrary cut-off that is set, you will find that operators under that extreme economic pressure from the top of supply chains will put in place systems where it's 13 kilometres or 12 kilometres. That's consistently been the pattern in this industry until we can deal with those underlying causes.
I'm a bit interested in the language that you use there, Michael. You say drivers forced. No one's holding their foot to the pedal and no one's forcing them to tamper with their speed limiters. That's a choice.
Well, you're quite right. Drivers, and the vast bulk of them, are very professional and comply with the law. And maybe there's a question here of semantics about which words should be used. But certainly the evidence over the last 2 or 3 decades of drivers coming forward saying that they are under pressure to make a living. They've got a decision to make that perhaps no other Australian has to make and no Australian should be forced to make. And that is, do I keep the wheels turning? Do I keep my, for example, small business afloat by going out and staying on the road for another 10 hours, even though that's in breach of the logbook, so that I can put food on the table for my family? Or do I comply with the law? Now, no one's condoning breaches of the law, but no Australian should be put in that position in terms of that type of decision.
Michael, it's really good to talk with you this morning on 2 big issues, this draft legislation and also the RSRT uncertainty at the moment. Thank you very much for taking some time for me today.
Thanks, Anne.
Michael Cain, who is the National Assistant Secretary for the Transport Workers Union.